everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. Here, another drive. Went to the hills with my dog for a nice little hike. He's a fat, chubby little guy, so he needs all the exercise there is. Let's see, what is there to talk about? A couple of weeks ago, when I posted my video on the state of the channel and what people might want me to talk about, somebody asked me about Hegel and empirical science. What did I have to say about that? And I had started to work on a recording for that, and then I just left it because I sort of realized that the articles that I was using as my basis had some pretty glaring little holes there that I needed to fill, and with more determinate examples to clarify the issues. It's cow land here, so there's those cow grates. So I'm gonna go over the basic issues as I came up with them originally, and if things come up that I can clarify, I will. Rambling. So I have an article on my blog about, actually I have two, on the scientific character of Hegel's philosophy. And basically the main point of that is this, that Hegel's science is actually not that far from what we think regular science is. The empirical sciences, I'll make that distinction between empirical, what we normally think and call science, empirical science, and obviously Hegel's science with a capital S, which is philosophical science, absolute science, certain science. And so what Hegel's science has to do with, has an overlap with regular science, is that they're both about objectivity. They're very concerned about objectivity. The reason we like empirical science is because obviously it's about the objective world and how it really is. And Hegel's science also purports to be about this. Much harder to believe, I know. But the issue of contention then comes down to really what is objectivity. I think that the regular notion that we have about the objective is precisely that it is that which exists independently of us and of other things, and which is what it is through its own self. It is the basis of its own being. That's what makes it independent. That's why it can resist us. That's why it can stand against us. And it imposes itself on us. The objective is there regardless of what we want to believe about it. And Hegel believes basically the same. That the objective is indeed that which is independent, that which is in and for itself. And because of that, when it confronts anything other than itself, it shows its own resistance because it is an independent being. Regular science, however, empirical science, tends to have an issue when they try to determine what objectivity, not what objectivity is, but what the objective things are. Because what the objective things are for empirical science are those things which everything breaks down to. So, everything's built out of atoms, everything's made out of, all biological things are made out of genes. Everything reduces down to some interplay of matters and forces. And for empirical science, that's the objective. Those little pieces that you can break down until you can't break them down anymore. And before you think that I'm talking crazy talk and nobody actually believes this, that's not true. Most people who are into scientism and who are into physics tend to have this really ridiculous view that nothing is real except those fundamental building blocks. That it's the same reason that there are the eliminativists for universal things who say that unitary things don't exist. It's all just parts. And what are the only real parts that exist? Well, the fundamental parts of matter. We used to think that was atoms. We now think that is some quarks or 23-dimensional vibrating strings. And so those are the only real objective things. Everything else is just a conglomeration and combination of these real things, and everything else is to that extent unreal because it does not actually have objective independent being. It can always be broken down. It is contingent. And the weird thing about this level of objectivity for empirical science is that when you get to the objective is incomprehensible. It is unintelligible. There's really nothing to say about it other than that it is. You break things down to the fundamental units of matter, the fundamental units of space, time, energy, and the forces, the fundamental forces, relations. And you can't say what these things are in themselves, why they are, how they are. You can only say that they are. Hegel, on the other hand, has a completely inverted sense of this, in which, for Hegel, that which is objective and independent is not the little fundamental building blocks of everything else. Rather, it is the orders which order these fundamental building blocks at every level. So, you may say, well, the 23-dimensional vibrating string is the most objective thing for empirical science, whereas in Hegel's science it would be something, okay, so it exists, it's determined in a certain way. You go up a level of existence, you get into the spatial temporal material, and then you say that the spatial temporal material determines itself according to some other way, which is unique to its level. It's emergent, but it is not emergent from below. A lot of people seem to have this mistake. This is a mistake of emergentism in general, in which things are said to emerge magically, as if they are not imminent to the lower orders. For Hegel, what emerges is simply a revelation of what was already there. So, you have things happening at the atomic level which don't happen at the 23-dimensional string level. Well, it's because there's something new at the atomic level that isn't there at the 23-dimensional level. And so this newness ends up determining the way that the 23-dimensional strings themselves are arranged. And you up a level from atoms and you go to chemistry, and chemistry then now arranges atoms in a way that atoms themselves, from their own immanent determinations, don't arrange themselves, but to the determinations of chemistry they do. And then you get the biological, and the biological subsumes the chemical subsumes the atomic, and the physical subsumes the 23-dimensional, and it orders them around. It orders them into its own body. It generates its own body out of them. So even though it depends on these things, it is not determined by these things. Dependency here is a conditional dependency, in which so long as the conditions are met, the existence is guaranteed. So, so long as you have certain combinations of genetic material, amino acids, and you have them housed in a certain structure of lipids, fats, to create a membrane. And so long as a couple of the conditions are met, you have a living organism. And every time those conditions are met, you have a living organism. But those lower elements don't determine how that living organism is as a living organism. Those atoms aren't what tell the amoeba to do amoeba things. The amoeba things happen at the level of the biological. Likewise, you get up to the levels of psychology, mind, subjective experiences, as well as then objective perceptions, objective figurations of, say, conscious beings like us. We objectify rules, we make laws, etc., etc. And then finally you get mind that is self-determining in that it can conceive its own thoughts and determines its own thoughts and is aware of how that determination goes about, so it knows how to conceptualize. And for Hegel, it's that top level which is for him the most objective, because it is the most concrete. It is the one level that is determining all the other bottom levels for itself. For example, you as a conscious being, as a mental being, order your entire biological body to do as you will, consciously. Your biological body then is always already unconsciously, because you don't have to think about it. The cells just do it, ordering the elements of nature around to constitute itself, doing things which we still to this day do not understand. For example, we still to this day don't understand really how the hell enzymes lower the necessary activation energy for certain reactions. We know that they do, we don't know how. We don't know why that is. And from Hegel's perspective, as well as the empirical scientific perspective, the objective for what the empirical scientists consider objective is not really objective. Because for Hegel, those things are more dependent. The higher you go into the level of, on the hierarchies of being, for Hegel, the orders of being, the freer you are, the more self-determination is available to to that level of being. And for him, that's what it means, because it is more independent. It is what it is, more because of itself, more due to itself, and it is capable of maintaining itself as itself and making itself according to its own level of order, as opposed to, say, everything else that has, for example, the lower orders of atoms. Atoms are what they are, not because of any conscious being. They are what they are, and they do what they do not because of entirely their own doing. Atoms just float around willy-nilly in space, buffeted around by the forces of nature. And internally they are what they are because of their own internal principles, so they have objectivity to that extent, but they are not the most subjective thing. So Hegel has levels of objectivity as well, whereas in science things are either ultimately objective or they're not. So you have weird people who say, well, there are no such things as apples or organisms or all it's all just a bunch of atoms bumping into each other, buffeted by the forces of nature, driven by the forces of nature, yada yada yada. And that's a pretty weird way to look at things. These are the kind of people who would be extreme nominalists who, just to be pedantic, would tell you, no, you don't really exist. It's not only that the mind doesn't exist, the brain doesn't exist, the body doesn't exist. These are just conglomerations of the fundamental units, and the fundamental units are the real things that exist. These people would go so far as to just say, no, even genes don't exist, because what exists is ultimately the 23-dimensional strings vibrating. According to what? We don't know. Why? We don't know. We just know that they do. It just is. And that's part of the problem, that in saying that things just are, you don't offer an explanation. You just kind of give up, and you just bend down to the brute facts of what appears to you, which you fail to explain. And because it simply appears to you, and you can't explain it, you just give in to it. It's like magic, It baffles you, and the more you try to explain it, the less sense it seems to make, and so you just give up, and you say, well, it's real, don't know how it works, but it works. From Hegel's perspective, the atomic world, the lower levels world of nature, are the least subjective because they are the most dependent. look at it from the level of the top level, the atoms are dependent for their being as what they are, where they are, and how they are, due to the higher level orders of nature. You know, we know that, strange as it is, biological organisms have capacities of basically transmutation. You know, no matter how you put it, you know, they can change. Sorry, cow kind of going weird on the side. Life can basically transmute elements. You know, that's how it builds its own body. Pretty neat. So Hegel would say, well, then these things are actually dependent on the higher level orders, even though they aren't always dependent. You know, atoms aren't just made by bodies. They aren't just transmuted by bodies. Stars engage in fusion and all these other things, and also chemical reactions just happen in nature. And obviously the atomic level has an independent level that doesn't always have to be generated by the higher level. But that the fact that the higher level can always subsume that lower level makes it so that logically we can talk about those lower levels as being ultimately dependent on these higher levels. Because these higher levels are what give intelligibility. They explain why things are as they are at the lower levels, and why they are where they are, and how they are doing what they're doing. So that's a very different notion of objectivity that Hegel has for his science, and which the lower notions of empirical science have for their science. Another thing is also to do with the objectivity, not of things, but of concepts. The concepts which science, empirical science, uses are, for the most part, just sort of slapped on. Like, we never quite know with empirical science if we've got the real thing in mind, or if we just have an appearance. That is, if we just have an interpretation. And an example that can be given for that is the examples of quantum mechanics and interpretations around that. In popular consciousness, the most popular interpretation of quantum mechanics is the Copenhagen Interpretation, which is a weird quantum wave probability class because you observe it bullshit. It's very mystical, very weird, magical. People love it because it's basically magic. It basically tells them magic is real. Basically, it's also a bit of a mystical thing because it gives some primacy to consciousness in creating the universe, which I think there is, but at the same time, it's nowhere in the sense of the way the Copenhagen Interpretation posits it. Well, there's that interpretation, which is popular. The popular amongst most physicists probably would be the multiple worlds interpretation, which I think is a lot of nonsense too. things and completely misconceive what the reality is. And so we have multiple interpretations, which are always possible at all times, no matter what. Just because nobody has put forth anything that yet functions doesn't mean anybody can't, because it's just like mathematics. You just have to think about it well enough and account for things well enough that you can come up with a new theory which will completely reinterpret things. And if you ever look into the fringe of science, you will find that there are plenty of theories. Now, you may not think they're as good, although then I think a lot of things come down to interpretations of what you mean by as good. Is the interpretation just not as good? Is it not as coherent? Or is it the fact that you're just kind of miffed that it's not as functionally ready as the theory that we have worked on with the epicycles for the last 100 years has been? Maybe so, but then those are subjective notions which really still don't speak to the objective reality of your interpretation. You can always create new interpretations, and you will never be sure. So, with empirical science, we never know that we've really got the real objective thing. And of course, Hegel has this other thing, which we don't derive concepts from the empirical. We don't just slap concepts together and think that they're valid because we observe them. Things like particle wave duality, for example, which is a whole lot of nonsense. It's not a real concept. It's not a real concept. It's not intelligible at all. There is a way to make sense of it, by the way, but it's not the way that's usually made sense of. And obviously involves dialectics. Energy is another thing that doesn't make sense. It's a real nonsense concept. Space-time relations and relativity are a lot of nonsense. There's no reason to think that those things are coupled at all. There is a reason that you can give that is intelligible, but it's not what Einstein gives. There are arbitrary concepts such as the speed of light being fixed. Why we would think that is beyond me. Why we would posit that is never really explained. We just kind of assume that it is because Einstein said it is. And there you go, So anyways, I think that's all that I've got to say about that for now. We'll see what I post about later. I'll definitely keep working on that video. Well, it's not a video, but it's just a recording. But I'll definitely try to clarify my thoughts more on this, because it is an interesting thing. Hegel has direct arguments about this in the philosophy of nature, for example. In the introduction, he talks about how empirical science gets its concepts and how it thinks about the world, and how this is bound to lead you to some very weird ideas, which, if you actually think about them, are nonsense.